Okay, so welcome everyone. Yes, this is our 19th Lunch and Learn for the year. We are very excited today, very important topic. Our topic has been hosted today by Hitch Advisory, and they do legal advice differently. So very excited to hear today from Abby and Ophelia. They're in SA at the moment. Talking to us. So they will be talking about auditing for excellence. So all about compliance, how franchisors protect and strengthen their networks. So without further ado, I will introduce, give it all across to the girls, sorry. But if you've got any questions as we go along, please pop it in the chat and then we'll get to it in the last 15 minutes. So without further ado, over to Abby.
Thank you, Helen. Hi, everyone. As Helen had said, I'm here with Ophelia, who I work closely with in Adelaide. I have been, just a little bit of a summary before Ophelia jumps in, I've been in the franchising industry for almost 10 years. Before working with Hitch, I was in franchise compliance for franchise networks. So this is something that is really, I love this space of franchising, which is quite nerdy to say. But yes, so that's a little bit of my background. Ophelia?
Yeah, I'm a senior associate in the franchising team at Hitch. We have the benefit of working across so many different franchise networks. And yeah, definitely this topic today blends, a bit of the legal, but also this is very operational. How do we make kind of something that sounds maybe as rigid as auditing really work for a business and help it thrive. So hopefully everyone takes something from today's topic and, feel free to add any questions in the chat. We can go through them at the end and hopefully everyone comes away with a few nuggets of wisdom here.
So before we go to the next slide, we probably just want to set the scene for auditing for excellence. So funny when you talk the word auditing, I suppose a lot of franchisees really get scared with this word. I think historically it's been seen as a policing method. I love breaking that thought process and really driving the benefit of audits and why they're so important for both franchisee and franchisors. Really, because at the end of it, you're trying to help support, strengthen, and ultimately drive the success of a network. So it's so crucial that franchisees are involved in every step of the journey with them, and so that they can start to see that approach of how is it going to benefit me rather than why am I getting in trouble. I think one of the most fabulous things that I've ever taken away from working in this space was when I came into a role and rolled out an audit program. I remember one of the franchisees wasn't too impressed and referred to me as the snotty-nosed graduate coming in telling them how to do their business, which, at the end of the day, I absolutely get it. But by the end of the 3 years, change management with the whole auditing process, they really saw the benefit of it and enjoyed actually when those store reviews would happen and how beneficial it was for them.
Definitely.
All right, so auditing. Why is it important?
Look, from a franchisor perspective, obviously it is the way that you can, understand the health of your franchise system. Franchising is a way for you to scale your business without having to fully be in the weeds of the business, but it is important to make sure you've got a really good oversight of what is happening across your network. And there's just so many, honestly, the auditing is almost like a broad way of saying like your tool belt for your franchisees, like how can I look under the hood and see everything's working.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I think also too, a lot of franchisees, if I go into the operational aspect of it, get store blindness. So a lot of them will do the groundhog, day in, day out routine, and then they won't necessarily see those potential, not necessarily pitfalls, but where they've kind of lacked in one area or, had their focus on something else. Whereas the audits from an operational component is great because someone with fresh eyes comes in and sees those little bits that need tweaking just to get them back onto the path of operating as per the brand standards. I think that's a massive for franchisees to just understand that, it is beneficial for them because they might get that store blindness or van blindness or whatever their system is, whatever store or site or vehicle that they have. There are components where they will overlook it because they're so busy working on the business.
Exactly. We were actually just recently at a client's franchise conference, and one of the franchisees put their hand up in a panel session asking, I feel like I am really bogged down in kind of the day-to-day grind of the business, especially in those early days when you've just recently had a franchisee join. They're trying to figure out, what's the best way to be running the systems, the processes you've given them. Auditing can also be a great way for you to step in, see how people are going. Just it doesn't need to be as rigid as obviously some of the key important audits that you need to be doing, but also just a checkpoint for the franchisee to get their head above water and go, okay, really, how am I going? And come to the franchisors asking, am I meeting your standards as well? So it really can become quite a two-way street, not necessarily just always a franchisor telling a franchisee what they're doing wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So going off the back of that, there are so many different types of audits that a franchisor and also too a franchisee could implement within their site themselves. We've got a couple on the screen there. But today we're really going to probably focus more on the operational side of audits. So looking at site audits, studio audits, and then talking a little bit too about the payroll component, because we know that that's hot topic at the moment. And there is that fine line of, how much is too much, how little is too little. And then obviously not having done anything at all is not not something that you should be doing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you can, I've definitely seen some franchisors get almost overwhelmed. Like, for example, seeing a list like this and thinking, geez, how many different audits do I need to be doing? What are the head office costs of these? And, there are, it doesn't, just because there are so many different types of audits doesn't mean every single one applies for your business.
Yeah.
I think what is key here is making sure that you sit down and identify what are the key areas of your business that from a legal compliance perspective, what could I be held liable for? Obviously, that's very important. And as lawyers, that's always going to be, number one for us. But then also operationally, what are the areas where people can slip quite quickly or things that can kind of fall to the bottom of the pile? Audits are a great way of just making sure that your standards across your network are being met, whether that's how your branding's looking, what the customer service experience is like. I know a lot of clients that use these audits as a way of refreshing with franchisees how they're expecting that customer experience to be. Google reviews and TripAdvisor reviews and everything, they're becoming so popular now. Everyone looks at them when they want to go and engage with someone, or, you could go into the depths of Reddit and there's some scathing reviews on there for different businesses. And so this can be a good way to kind of, okay, how do we learn from past mistakes and what consistency do we need to be rolling out here?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it would be remiss of us to not talk about how to actually, roll out an audit across your franchise system. And essentially the first place you should be starting is making sure your franchise agreement actually has the ability for you to audit. I think most franchise agreements, or you'd hope, do have that general right that the franchisor can come in and look at, your books and records. That's generally the most common term that's used. But what is the most important part of your clause here is making sure it's actually a tool you can use and rely on, especially in circumstances where maybe you have a regulator's inquiry coming in, you have an issue with compliance with the franchising code. You really want these audit clauses to be working for you. So it's not just something that's on writing and something that the lawyers will throw around here and there. It really can be something that helps you in some difficult situations with your franchisees. So the first part of an audit clause would be starting with the scope. So making sure your clause is really clear on what the purpose of the audit is for. So you can have general audit provisions, but for things like financial records, for work health safety, fair work audits, I think there's no harm in being more specific. It just means that there is hopefully less friction when you're actually trying to roll out those audits, especially in times when maybe a franchisee's a bit disgruntled or feels maybe a bit targeted, of making sure that this is really clearly stipulated in that franchise agreement. So like I'd said before, a lot of franchise agreements will just say, you know, we have the right to audit your books and records. By keeping that super general, yes, you can try and argue and, you know, give a job to your lawyers to argue why a specific audit is necessary and falls under books and records. But being explicit with what the purpose of the audit is will help avoid some of the standoffs with your franchisees, and also helps reduce the risk of a dispute about reasonableness. The next part is your access and process. So when you're rolling out your audits, your franchise agreements should stipulate more of the process-driven aspects of an audit. So what is considered reasonable notice for an audit? When can an audit be undertaken? Where is the audit being carried out? So obviously, in the past, you've had the ability to, if you're doing a store audit, you have to go in. But if you're doing an audit of, you know, payroll records, a lot of franchise systems are moving on to the, you know, cloud-based platforms where a franchisor does have the ability to log in and just have a look through of what's happening. But being really clear on that as well in the franchise agreement makes it franchisees feel just a little bit more settled, especially if there is potentially something going on that no one's trying to pull the wool over their eyes. There's actually, you know, we're following a process here that is applied across the entire network. So consistency, which we'll touch on again later, is super important here. You also want the ability to use a third-party auditor. This can be a great way to show impartiality, so that it's not necessarily just someone from head office coming in. Again, this will really depend on the type of audit that you are undertaking, but those third-party auditors can be a great, you know, I guess not a mediator, but, you know, just a bit of a sounding board, especially if there's some friction between the franchisee and franchisor.
Yeah, yeah.
But if, you know, as much as possible, if you can build in more of the ways in your system that there's online processes, online ways for you to be accessing this information, it does create a lot less interruption and interference with the franchisees' day-to-day business operations, which is another way of making these audits much more seamless with your franchisees. When it comes to your costs and consequences of an audit, again, really important to have that clearly stipulated in the franchise agreement. So commonly we'll see that a franchisee only needs to pay the cost of the audit if a discrepancy is found. So for example, if there's underpayment by a certain percent, the franchisee needs to pay the cost of the audit. But we also need to consider here, okay, what happens if we do find problems in the audit? What's the process that we should be following there? And one common mistake we see is that the audit provisions don't actually tie into your breach provisions. So being able to rely on the breach notices, hopefully not having to rely on immediate termination, but if some of those circumstances apply, especially now that there are the immediate termination provisions with Fair Work breaches, it's really important that the franchise agreement is clear here so that you have a clear process of, okay, how can we fix this? And what are the choices that we have if we do have non-compliance, non-remediation? Another aspect that we are seeing more and more frequently brought up with franchisees is confidentiality and privacy, especially now that we are in an age where, you know, there are so many data breaches happening all the time that franchisees are becoming more careful on what information is being shared, what their obligations are when they're sharing information. So being very clear on how information is going to be handled that you're taking out of your audits. Having a well-drafted privacy policy always is a great kind of backing for these audit provisions too. And you know, this does build more trust with your franchisees as well of exactly how that information is going to be used. Now, obviously, the frequency of your audits, the best way for you to be roll out a routine audit for franchisees is having that stipulated in the franchise agreement. And I would say most franchisors do have that, but also it's so important to include that you have the ability to audit if an emergency happens. So being able to step in really quickly to do a quick health check on what's happening in an area of the business that someone has raised a red flag to is so important because otherwise, I think in the heat of the moment, sometimes people don't realise that they actually don't have the right to be stepping in at that certain point in time. And it could be too late by the time the period for a routine audit comes up to have actually addressed the issue that's at hand. So obviously these clauses, as we were saying, can apply to for your marketing fund audits is obviously a really clear one, but making sure that you have audit provisions worked into, you know, with for your suppliers, for brand standards, obviously payroll, work health and safety, having a really clear franchise agreement clause for auditing is going to be the best way that you can keep a good pulse check on how the business is doing, but also be able to have the tools to step in when things are going pear-shaped for that franchise business.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really great summary there of the audit provisions. But yeah, I think it's fascinating how many franchisees still feel either targeted, you know, why this is just happening with me, or whereas, you know, if you do that whole wide, especially for a brand reputation point of view, doing whole of network, and I'm talking more probably the operational component with you know, your payroll audits, doing whole of network is going to be extremely costly, and probably an overreach really. Yeah. But for your operational ones, it's that tying in that as well, and also to having a bit of your backbone process in the operations manual to really flesh out, you know, what their expectation for the audits should look like. You know, you can dabble a little bit with your franchise agreement provisions, but really you can flesh it out a little bit more in your ops manuals to be able to make sure that franchisees know what's coming, how frequent, you know, and then they've got that, not necessarily they've got the tools ready there, but it's pretty much outlining, you know, this is when it's going to happen, this is the steps that are going to take, and that just helps to further support your provisions in the franchise agreement.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's a great point on setting expectations, and the franchise agreement can be such a stagnant document. Obviously, you know, if you've got a 5-year term, a lot can happen in 5 years, whether that's changes to your business model, changes in law, the operations manual, and being able to rely on that along with the kind of general provisions of your franchise agreement means you can change and adapt, and you know, obviously within reason, and having a reasonable backing for why certain changes need to happen. But it also means franchisors can be on the front foot when, you know, there are changes that happen or things that they really need to urgently be addressing, that they've got those processes in the franchise agreement and the operations manual.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm sure many of us saw the recent Baker's Delight case with the Fair Work Ombudsman, and I think the question on the screen, how does the Baker's Delight change expectations on franchisors? The oversight might actually be, rather than changes, reinforced expectations on franchisor oversight, because a lot of what has come out of the Baker's Delight case isn't necessarily new. It's just, I think, shining a brighter spotlight now on what the expectations are on a franchisor. So look, I won't go into the weeds of the case because there are plenty of articles online that provide an excellent summary. But just for context, in 2023, the Fair Work Ombudsman took Baker's Delight Holdings, who was the franchisor, to the federal court, alleging that Baker's Delight was legally liable for over $1 million in underpayments to mostly younger staff across 3 of their Hobart stores between 2017 to 2020. The Fair Work Ombudsman was claiming that Baker's Delight became aware of underpayment issues through an audit that was conducted around 2019. While Baker's Delight had alerted the franchisee of the underpayment issues, there was no follow through on what they should be doing afterwards for rectification, and then for Baker's Delight role in checking in on whether the underpayments had been rectified. So it was alleged that these underpayments actually continued. So the Fair Work Ombudsman sought penalties, orders requiring back payments, interest, super, not just against the franchisee operators in Hobart, but also against the franchisor and the franchisor's executives. So while this isn't the first time the Fair Work Ombudsman has tried to pin liability on a franchisor under the Fair Work Act, it is probably the clearest signal we've had as of late that franchisors can't take a back seat when it comes to oversight of the franchisee operations. The key lesson that you should be taking out of this case is that a franchisor oversight cannot be passive. It's not something that you set and forget. I think that's a term so frequently used, but it's an ongoing and ever-changing responsibility. You have an ongoing obligation to be monitoring, detecting, and responding to any compliance risks that are going on across your network. And I think something that I've taken out of this case is that your systems and standards are actually only as good as your implementation of them and your willingness to use them. So, not just having processes in place, but actually acting on them. So one of the themes that I saw come out of this, which I thought was interesting from an audit perspective, was the court's analysis of readily available operational data. So that's your, obviously sales data, but then wages to sale ratios, staffing rosters, supplier volumes. A lot of these online platforms now can actually be revealing anomalies that warrant a closer look. So if those signals are ignored, because a lot of these systems can raise the issues for you, a franchisor can no longer claim, well, we just didn't know. If you have a lot of these platforms readily available, you need to actually be going in and checking, making sure that if there are red flags raised, you're doing something about it and you're documenting how you're doing something about it.
Yeah.
So I think an expectation coming out of this case now is that franchisors will actually use their dashboards, the thresholds that they enforce, and investigate any outliers throughout the system, especially when you're looking at one specific franchisee. You can't just file these records away anymore and just pull them out once someone starts looking. You need to be doing something at the time that you identify them. Another theme is documenting how you are actually actioning what's coming out of the issues that you're finding in the audit. So obviously things like policies and training manuals are really important, but checking how many of your franchisees are actually doing these training modules that you're sending out. How are you following up the franchisees who aren't completing the training? What are the consequences if they're not completing it? So I think I have a few clients who, you know, they roll out quite frequent workplace training, whether that's for work health and safety, for fair work. But the question is, okay, well, who's actually looking at them and what are they doing about it?
Yeah.
So making sure that you have an audit trail essentially that shows, you know, your remediation records, your follow-ups, and then any escalation notes. So while a breach notice can be like the legal way of going about it, there are a lot of other ways as well that you can stay on top of the franchisees and show that you are genuinely trying to figure out what's going on and how can we fix it here. So that's that can be through like actual data that you're collecting out of your franchise systems. It can be through email correspondence with your franchisees, but really making sure that you've got clear identification of issues, a clear directive given to the franchisees, what exactly needs to be fixed as a result of an audit, and setting a timeline for remediation is key here. And then verifying that everything's actually been done, I think, is one of the biggest things that franchisors can often fall off on. Of, well, we've got the breach notice there and they know exactly how to be remedying it, but are you checking that they've remedied it? You know, you can't just say, well, if they don't, we'll terminate and we'll be fine.
Yeah.
If you're investigated later, that's not going to hold up. The third case, the third theme coming out of the Baker's Delight case that I thought was interesting was the role of the franchisor's head office staff. The franchisor HQ is, you know, they work so hard on so many different aspects of the business. You know, they're trying to juggle brand growth, marketing, compliance, trainings, but often compliance is where you find that there's a big gap, just because there's really not, it doesn't affect your immediate bottom line, which makes complete sense from an operational perspective. But I think what this case is highlighting is that the courts are looking at whether the franchisors have appropriate personnel and the training and the tools to be auditing and to be monitoring remediation, and whether there is actually the ability for a franchisor to have created, you know, separate roles for compliance. I think the biggest pitfall here is if you are under-resourcing in a from a compliance perspective, a lot of your goals with auditing, why you're doing it, are just going to be more, you know, aspirational rather than like operational. You know, how is this actually working for the business? So it's not enough to just, you know, hope that franchisees are complying. You need real evidence of how they're complying, how you investigated it, and what you're doing about it.
Yeah. And I think, you know, it's a lot of the themes that come with all that you've said there from the Baker's Delight case is so similar to what you would implement for a site review or a brand, you know, an operational audit, you know, for your brand reputation, making sure that your franchisees are following the system. So yeah, a lot of those themes that they've pulled out as something that you would find in that operational audit that you're doing. So, and I know that, you know, you say payroll audit to a franchisor or a client, and it is so overwhelming. You know, it is a space that has always probably been there, but hasn't really had the light on it of needing to be, or the franchisor needing to have ownership in that space to this degree. So yeah.
I remember recently at the for those of us who were at the franchising conference, there was a session, especially on the Baker's Delight case, and there was an excellent question from one of the audience members saying, look, I'm a franchisor with 300 franchisees across the country. How am I supposed to be, you know, meeting the expectations that the courts obviously enforcing in this Baker's Delight case? And I think an excellent example was given of how to try and maintain processes was, creating random auditing. Again, building that into your franchise agreement, and that, at certain points in the term, there'll be a random audit of franchisees. They need to give, for example, with payroll, pay slips, wage rates and awards, and so that you can start getting a good, I think it's a great health check from across the network. Okay, just overall, how are we doing? And then what are the key areas we need to be focusing on?
Yeah. And I think those key areas are really great for things like conferences, where you can hold sessions to be able to educate and further expand the knowledge of your franchise network.
Exactly.
So that's a really, really good point. Yeah. Right, so this is, I'll give Ophelia a little bit of a break for the moment. So this practical framework, I really, the operational audits that I have implemented, like Ophelia had said, a lot of franchisors will do a set and forget. So they'll implement it and then they'll do them, but they'll forget, I suppose, the why, what's in it for the franchisor for these. So I think the plan, do, check, act framework is really great. So, you're planning your audits, whether that's once you have them implemented, you're, continuously reviewing the questions year on, year out. Are they still relevant? Are there ones that, we can separate? Are there two different components that we can then do the audits, operational audits, separately? And then obviously you're going out and you're conducting your audits or your store reviews, and then you're checking, obviously, the data that you've got. Does it then come back to you why you're doing it? Is it your franchisees complying to the brand standards? Do you have consistent shortfalls or consistent areas that need improvement, or the operations manual's not supportive enough for your franchisees to then be able to be getting to that brand standard more consistently? And then your act is obviously, when you do your reviews, you're wanting to make sure that any discrepancies that you do find against the system are implemented through, not necessarily a breach notice. That's going to be your last resort if a franchisee is not then going to address any of the shortfalls that you have found. Obviously, in a safety point of view, that's probably more prevalent, where you would go straight to a breach depending on the severity of a safety issue that you've found. But yeah, making sure that you've identified areas that your franchisees can then help to increase their brand standards to get it back on track. So, it might be 10 things that they need to focus on, and then you're setting a time frame for how do they do that. And you're checking in again to see that they're hitting the mark. Do they need further support? Are they understanding where to find, that section of the operations manual to further support them to be able to get back onto brand standards?
Definitely.
And this all comes back down to ensuring, one, you've got your consistency with your franchise network, but you're also then increasing your franchisees' success, because at the end of the day, they're complying with the brand standards to a point that it's going to be consistent nationally. If you're a national franchise network, if you're only in certain amount of states, you've still got that brand consistency, which really drives your brand reputation as well.
Definitely. One of the great ways we've seen like amazing success in franchisors in the act phase is, once they've got the results of their audit, they actually plan a meeting with their franchisees, and so that they can ensure that the franchisees really clear on what the expectations are, but also feels that it's almost collaborative of, the franchisor like giving ideas on how this can be improved, or the franchisee can give feedback of maybe why something's been failing or maybe isn't up to standard. So I think making this a really open communication point between franchisees, franchisors is really important.
Yeah, and I love that two-way communication. I think a franchisor implements a really great system, but then the really great thing about franchisees is a lot of them will find, little improvements that help their store. And sometimes with your store reviews, those little nuggets that you do find actually help your system. Whether you take that approach to a conference and then you can get that franchisee on a panel, or, share their experience about it. So it's really, I actually think it's such a positive step to make sure that you do have those store reviews, or site audits to make sure that, everyone is involved and everyone's along the journey for it.
Yeah. Beautiful. I think we've got just enough time for any questions from the chat I'm not sure if we can see.
We might have to throw back to Helen to see if there's any chat.
Nothing.
No one's typed anything, but I do have a question here. What are some common mistakes that have been made in the past with respect to audits? Can you give us a couple of common ones?
Yeah, I'll start off, and I can really speak probably from the experience that I've had with seeing rolling out audits. I think a lot of them, if you're not bringing your franchisees along for the journey, you will obviously get a lot of that pushback in terms of the why. Why are they doing this? It's, you're coming in to tell me all the things I'm doing wrong. Whereas if you're taking your franchisees along the journey of this is why it's important and this is why it's going to benefit you, you'll get far less resistance for those store reviews, and you'll get a lot more buy-in from franchisees to see that actually it is benefiting myself and my store, or my site, my vehicle, my business. And so I think a lot of mistakes is just from experience. Some franchisors can go in too hard too soon and not really prepare their network for, okay, this is how we're going to do things now. And this is coming from, if you haven't looked at your auditing provisions and you haven't probably turned your eye to that compliance component of creating a compliance check for your store reviews. I think that for me is probably the big one of getting your franchisees on board and along with the journey.
Yeah. I would say a common issue we see is franchisors not consistently applying audit processes across a network. Maybe just implementing an audit when they've identified a problem. Sometimes this can make franchisees feel that they're being unfairly targeted. So by showing that, look, we generally do these routine audits at these points. And then otherwise, if we see XYZ issues come up, we're going to audit. It just takes some of the sting out of the audit, because, franchisees they're proud business owners, and many of them treat their businesses like their baby. So they will quickly defend if they need to. And so if it just makes it a much smoother process if you can show that, we are doing it for this territory and your territory and a few other territories as well, or we recently did it in this area, and just not kind of pulling it out of the blue. I think it's the easiest way to make this a much more seamless process, as opposed to kind of a quick emergency, slapdash, we need to get in there to figure out what's going on.
Yeah. And I think, there's so many from an operational audit perspective. And I mean, you've got your payroll systems as well that you could do your health checks for, but there's so many online systems now, platforms that you can implement store reviews quite easily. And I think that's a really good way for franchisees to also have access to those, so they can see their results. That it's not I'm going to come in, I'm going to do this audit, and you can't have a look at the report, or you can't have access to the report. So I think those platforms are a really, really good tool as well to be able to have that consistent engagement from both franchise or franchisee.
Definitely.
Thanks, girls. We do have a question here from Nick McCosey. Consistency is so important, but some franchisors are aligning their field support teams along lines of franchisee support need. For example, those who want to run faster, those who just are keeping up, and those who are at risk of failing, as each of these tiers may need different support. How is that viewed and handled with auditing? Can they treat different franchisees differently regarding the auditing? Yeah.
So for your operational audits, I suppose you're always going to have your higher performing franchisees in a network. So, those that are been probably in the system for a little while, they've really nailed, their their approach to the brand. Then you'll have some that come in who might be new, so they're still trying to understand, find their feet. So I think in terms of the audit in general, it absolutely should be the same. You know, it shouldn't be different here, there. However, the audit results will differ. So the ones that have been in, you know, let's say as franchisees been in for 20 years, they actually might have they might be a really great performer, but they might have the worst results because they have maybe had complacency in that they've been doing it for so long and they are a high performing store, but they might have dropped the ball on, you know, their signage or the store presentation. So I think in terms of the results that come from those audits is absolutely where it'll differ. But all of the questions, I'm a firm believer, should be you're comparing, you know, apples to apples. So you need to have that fairness in your audits to make sure that every store is then benchmarked the same. So then you can use those results and the data for the franchisor benefit as well.
And from a legal perspective, obviously you need to make sure as a franchisor you're acting in good faith and reasonably. And so that's why I 100% agree with rolling out a consistent audit requirement across, and so with your standards. But if you decide, you know, based on the circumstances of a franchisee that maybe you won't take certain action on some areas or give them extra time to comply, that is acting reasonably because you're considering what the needs of a franchisee are, as opposed to taking a hardline approach that maybe is just not achievable for them at that point in time. So I think that's where you can tailor your response to be reasonable for a franchisee.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep, great. Yep, Nick says thanks.
Thanks.
We've only got 1 or 2 minutes left. Any other questions? No, you girls, you ladies covered it very, very well. That was, very informative. Excellent. Thank you very much. We appreciate that advice. And I'm sure there was a few good nuggets there, you know, especially with auditing. Yeah, certainly a number one in compliance. And I'm sure there's all different versions of auditing, as in software that people can use as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kelly. Kelly said brilliant information. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
very much for today. Yeah, thanks for today, ladies. Hitch Advisory are a gold partner of the FCA, and so are always putting their hand up to help out, support, inform, educate, you know, and help everybody, especially during our lunch and learns. So on that note, we have our next lunch and learn coming up. I think it's next week. Yes. And that is at 12:15 next week. It's hosted by Square, which are a POS terminal partner. So please log in for that one. I'll send the invites out, but recordings of this will go out to everybody by Friday. So thank you everyone for attending, listening and supporting the Lunch and Learns. And I'll just quickly take this note to let everyone know that we have a mentoring webinar coming up at the end of November, and it's actually going to be how to write your nomination for the FIAs that are coming up in June next year. So how to actually win an award. So we're very excited about that one. So please let me know if you're not on the mentoring webinar list. Let me know that you want to be on that one, and I'll send you an invite. So thank you, everyone. Have a great what's left of your lunch.
Thank you.